I'm Brian Johnson, and this is the Always Articulate Attorney, Interpersonal Communication Skills. At the end of this program, you will learn how to give the same kind of care and precision to your speaking as you already do your writing. And you will grapple with this obvious reality. You do not write with typos, so let's get rid of those speakos, the ums, the likes, and the you knows as someone talking. And the only way to get to those two objectives is to understand how it is that your brain works when you are constructing an utterance. So here is how we are going to make you the always articulate attorney. We're going to take the challenge of speaking and we're going to break it down. And here's why we need to do that. Think about how many hours, days, weeks, months, years you have spent learning how to be a good writer. And compare that incredible number of years, starting when you were in elementary school, with the very little amount of time you've ever given much thought to how it is that you talk. Now, mind you, this is about interpersonal communication skills. I'm not talking about public speaking. I'm talking about you in your office talking to a client, or you talking to a colleague, you as the young lawyer reporting to that senior partner, you in a conference room dealing with a negotiation. How often have you really turned the camera back on yourself and said, how could I do this better? So we need to understand how it is that the body, the brain, and the voice work together. But fundamentally, in this situation, we're concerned about, first of all, how does the brain work to construct an utterance? In other words, how is it that thoughts get put together? And how can you both evaluate yourself and ultimately improve the skills you have as a thinker, which will improve the skills you have as a speaker? And the way you speak, of course, is not the same as you. It is a habit. People who talk fast have a habit of talking fast. People who say too much, it's a habit. The brain falls into many different habitual behaviors, and those habits can be changed. So we're going to start, first of all, with your brain and how it is that you think, and get you to think differently about thinking as we are on our way to speaking in that interpersonal sense. And therefore, we need to then move on to how it is that you talk, the rate at which you speak, the emphasis you put on important words, the silence that you leave between phrases to let your listener process and comprehend. So we're going to look at the brain first, then the voice. Then we're going to talk a bit about the mystery of what is the body's role in all of this. But when you think about it, speech and interpersonal communication is only happening because the body is literally in action. Think about me sitting here on this desk talking to you. This is only communication because my articulators are in action, articulating words. And they are being supported by my breath in action, which is projecting my voice. And my hands are doing whatever that mysterious stuff is that hands do. So much as the body might seem to be the least important part of this, we need to also look at what is the body's role. So we're going to put it together. We're going to look at the brain, we're going to look at the voice, we're going to look at your body, but we're ultimately on the way for you to figure out your style. So I'm in no way suggesting that, hey, do what I do, but rather I want to give you my ideas so you can figure out what you do. And it's a process of, first of all, raising your awareness to what you do, and then evaluating what it is that you do. So first you're aware, then you're evaluating, and then I'm going to give you some ideas, some pointers about how to make the improvements that you want to make. But ultimately it's about your style. It's about you being the always articulate attorney. And here's why it is so important. The world expects that lawyers are well-spoken. It's a given. The bar is set very high. The world thinks that lawyers know how to talk. And whether you're someone who has never faced the challenge of actually evaluating your skills, or you're someone who's given lots of thought and wants to get even better, I want to give you my ideas about how to meet that challenge, how to be not just at that bar, but above that bar, so that you are literally the always articulate attorney. So let's start by focusing on how brains work, especially how brains work when the pressure is on. So let's imagine a client comes to you and is upset and that gives you a little pop of adrenaline. Or you're sitting in a conference room and it's a tough negotiation, and that gives you a little pop of adrenaline. Or you're talking to a lawyer who's on the other side of the deal and they are being very hostile and aggressive, and that makes you have a little adrenaline. If you can be well spoken in those moments, you can be well spoken in those most casual moments. So what happens to us when that pressure is on? Well, adrenaline is an extraordinary hormone in the human body, and its effect on the brain is really important to understand because it has such a lot to do with how we control the pace at which we speak or not. So let's contemplate adrenaline in the brain. It has a big role in the body, but not so much when we're sitting in a conference room or listening to an angry client. It has much more at that moment to do with what is it doing to affect your brain. Well, adrenaline creates what we might call a time warp. It makes time slow down. And that resulting slowness, or the perception of slowness, is the simple reason why people talk too fast. People who are uncomfortable talk even faster because adrenaline has created this illusion that time has slowed down, and so the response is to speed up. So in order to get control of that fast-talking instinct at those moments of greatest discomfort, you need to really understand what's going on up there in the brain. Well, adrenaline sends extra time perception into the brain in the sense that time slows down. And think about what people say about those two responses to that moment when they literally are having a life or death response. When they really have that fear of, oh my gosh, that car is running the red light coming right at me, I'm about to die, and then the car swerves. Well, what do we say about those few seconds of terror when the car is coming at me and I think, oh my gosh, I'm about to die? Two things are universal. One, people say, it's as if everything went into slow motion. And number two, my whole life flashed in front of me. In those 3 seconds of, my life is about to end, time slows down and your whole life flashes in front of you. So in the brain, our perception is when the pressure's on, even sitting at a conference table or across the desk from an unhappy client, time has slowed down. And as a result, your tendency will be to talk too fast. So how do you control that? And what does it do in our brains that makes us least comfortable? Well, the simple truth is this. When time slows down, we are particularly ill at ease with this: silence. Because it seems to last so long. Because time has slowed down, 3 seconds seems like 10 or 12 or 15. And that's why everyone speeds up when they're nervous. Well, let me explain. When we get uncomfortable, we accelerate the pace. And we accelerate the pace because silence suddenly seems so completely inappropriate. But here's where silence is such an important part of your speaking style in an interpersonal communication moment. Silence is when your thought process needs to happen. And not only is silence when you are thinking, silence is when the listener is taking in and processing what it is that you need to say. Now, I would say, as a very personal response to that kind of moment, when I go to talk to one of my lawyers, whether it's my publishing lawyer or my lawyer that helps me with my wills and estates or the lawyer that helps me with my elderly father's property, the only thing that matters to me when I walk out of that meeting is, did I understand that? Is my money well spent because I walked out thinking, I understand it, and I understand what this lawyer is going to do to help me with that problem. So the silence that you are using as the speaker is the very silence that I, as the client, need to have to process what it is that you've said to me. So if you are someone who talks without that silence, so you have no time to think, and I have, as your listener, no time to process, it's a lose-lose situation. And those silences are so difficult to get comfortable with because they seem too long, but of course they're not. That's the time warp at work in our brains. Here's the concrete thing to understand about listeners, because ultimately you are the counseling that client, or you are working with that lawyer on the other side of the deal and you're trying to get them to understand you and your client's position. Listeners need time to process, and there's a name for that processing. It's called echo memory. And echo memory is just what it sounds like. As I'm speaking, what you're doing is echoing back what it is that I just said. And that silence is so critical to understanding. Think about it first from your perspective as the speaker. You need time, because you're constructing this utterance, to think, what do I say next? And if you don't have time for that thinking process to happen, you are not able to say well what it is that you need to say. What am I doing as your listener? I'm echoing back what you said. So I need time as the listener to process what it is that you're saying. So silence is the key to understanding the challenge of that interpersonal communication, because silence is when the thinking happens. It's when you're thinking, what do I say next to make this clear? It's when I'm thinking, what did he just say, and do I understand it? So we need to grapple with this notion that silence is the missing ingredient so often from interpersonal communication. We've got to add silence in a very concrete way. In fact, we need a technique in the brain to make that silence happen. So let's get rid of silence for a moment, and let's talk about what happens when we do that. When we get rid of silence, there's no time for you, the speaker, or the listener to process what you're saying. Think about if I speed up what I'm saying right now and I talk very quickly and I stumble over I trip over my tongue and I stumble over my words as I'm talking to you. Well, suddenly there's no time for me to think what I want to say next, and there's certainly no time for you to process. So very quickly you tune out. Or you're left in frustration thinking, there's another one of those fast-talking lawyers who doesn't give me any time to think. The more you give me that time to think, frankly, the smarter I find myself to feel, because I'm understanding what that lawyer is saying. And that silence is when I'm doing it. So you've got to be hyper aware of how much am I really letting my listener process what I'm saying. I've had the pleasure of working with attorneys, and exclusively attorneys, for over 30 years. And I don't think it's unfair to say that attorneys generally like to talk. It's a skill that many attorneys have. And I think that attorneys need to be doubly mindful, given that pleasure they take in talking, with that ability to stop and think and listen. Because especially when that silence happens, I, as the listener, have a chance to say, well, wait, let me ask you a question about that. And if I feel like you never turn off the faucet, if you just open it up and the words gush, and I have no time as your listener to process, I get frustrated and ultimately unhappy with the fact that I don't have that ability to listen and learn. So, once you understand the time warp of adrenaline slows everything down, you can accommodate that. You can say, I have this feeling that time is slowed down in this moment of speaking under some pressure here, but instead of letting that speed me up, I'm going to do the opposite. Recognizing that my listener, chances are, is not in the same kind of time warp. So what is only 2 seconds in reality but feels 4 seconds to me is 2 seconds. I need to give them time to think. So understanding how it is that our brains work in that simple way about the time warp leading to discomfort with silence, and ultimately our need to use that silence in a concrete way to control the pace, to have time to think and give the listeners time to think, is where being the always articulate attorney begins. So once you understand how important this whole notion of adrenaline and the time warp and silence and thinking is to actually having time to formulate the thought, and having time for the listener to process the thought, let's break it down even farther. How do our brains actually work to construct a thought? Have you ever thought about that? Well, there's a concept called chunking that is vitally important to this understanding. Our brains like information in chunks. Our brains like information in chunks. Those chunks might be the little chunks of phrases that I was just using. Our brains like information in chunks. That's sort of the micro chunk. There's also the macro chunk of our brains like to know that there's a beginning and a middle and an end. Those are chunks, but the big chunks, the phrases, are the little chunks. Well, as a speaker, it's so important to understand that the people listening to you as well as you, the speaker, have a brain that uses chunking all the time. So we have to come to terms in some way with putting together a thought, but understanding that we're not just blathering from beginning to end, but rather we're breaking up what we're saying very deliberately into chunks. So let's start with the big chunks. I think nothing is more helpful for both speaker and listener than to say, before I dive into the details, before I get to the trees, let's talk about the forest. In other words, let's look at the big chunks. So consider how I've laid out this program for you. I've said, okay, let's break it down into chunks. Here's how we're going to get control of how it is that you speak to be the always articulate attorney. Let's start with this chunk, your brain. And once we've got the brain under control, let's move on to this chunk, your voice. And once we've looked at your brain and your voice, let's add this final chunk, the mystery of your body. That's chunking, if you will. Think about how in conversation we will often say to someone, okay, let me describe to you the problem. There's a chunk. And then I want to give you the options we have for resolving that problem. And then finally, I want to give you my recommendation for what I think is the best solution to that problem. There's nothing more gratifying as the speaker than to know where you are. Instead of just wandering into the forest and wondering where I am, we've given that forest some shape. We've said, okay, we've got a problem, we've got some options, and let me give you my recommendation. So if you begin to think about how it is that you think, instead of leaping right to the details, to step back and say, let me give you a different perspective. Or you go to report to a colleague or a senior partner and you say, well, here is the assignment you gave me, and here is what I did in order to act on that assignment you gave me, and I've come up with this as the result. And just to say that, think of it, it's sort of like a table of contents, if you will. It gives you as the speaker some sense of where am I going. Let me talk about the assignment first. You asked me to do such and so. So I went off and did this and that. And ultimately, here's what I came up with. If you've got that ability to step back and say, before I jump into the details, I'm going to think about the structure, what I think of as kind of the cognitive infrastructure. It's like there we've built the big old bridge that we're now going to parade across. It gives the brain a little bit of help to know, where am I? Because I know where I've been, and I know where I'm going, and I know where I am at any given moment. So we're chunking on that macro level, but we're also chunking on this micro level. I'm using my voice right now in phrases as I speak to you. And the chunks of language, when you think about it, are phrases. That I'm saying what I'm saying to you in chunks. Now focus your attention on the silence between those chunks. Because those silences are my opportunity to say what chunk is next, and your opportunity to say, what did he just say and where are we going next? So there's this structure, the big chunks, beginning, middle, end, problem, option, solution, your brain, your voice, your body. And then there are those micro level chunks where we're breaking it down into phrases so that the listener understands. All of us need that time for thinking. So let's call this kind of talking, to allow you to be the always articulate attorney, structured improvisation. It's obviously not a recitation like an actor would do. That's not how we talk to people. And I'm not reading to you, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what our brains are actually quite good at. And that is to say, let me give you a structure, and then around that structure, I will improvise. You do that all the time. You say to a colleague, oh, we've got to talk about yesterday's meeting and tomorrow's important phone call with that client. And there's our structure. We've got a meeting. We've got a phone call tomorrow. And around that structure, you improvise regularly. But you've never thought of your thought process in that particular way. So first of all, we need that structure, that cognitive infrastructure, if you will. But then on the smallest level, as we're speaking about those things, we need to say that a phrase at a time, or a chunk at a time. And almost as important as the talking is the silence. So let's focus on the silence. And the biggest problem that I have spent the vast majority of my career helping lawyers of all experience levels, from brand new lawyers to senior partners, eliminating. And that is the thinking noises. the ums, the likes, the you knows. What are those things? If we can understand what they are, we can get rid of them. And why are they such a problem both for the speaker and for the listener? Well, I call them thinking noises for a particular reason. They are the noise we make when we need a second to think, and therefore that noise is rightfully called a thinking noise because, it's a 1 second monosyllable that gives us time to think. Thinking is essential, but the noise is not. So we could really define that habit, because that's all it is the habit in which we are basically unaware of this. I think, therefore, I So we need to give you permission to think, but we need to get rid of that And it is a pernicious habit. And my suggestion to you is, starting today after you've watched this video, you've got to raise your awareness to how much do I say Because as with all habits, you're not aware of it. You didn't wake up in the morning saying, today I will say 2,591 ums. They just come out. But they come out very connected to the thought process. So often when I'm working with someone and I get them to stop saying they have a momentary brain freeze because without the brain locks up. So a little bit like a brain surgeon, we're trying to get into the brain and take that scalpel and say, let's sever the connection between thinking and Let's do the thinking, but let's get rid of the So you need to raise your awareness to how much do you do it? I don't know, but I suspect you don't know either, because it's one of those unconscious habits that people have. If you're a young person, or you have young people in your life, like kids, there is no more pernicious habit that has come into our culture as we communicate than that one syllable word that has no meaning. It's not like I am comparing something that is like something else, it's just like. And so often, young lawyers have not taken the opportunity to think about, how do I transition my speech from that kind of college speech or college speak that I used in college and I took all the way through law school, and suddenly I'm in a professional environment. And I can't talk to a client that way, because it would be completely inappropriate. But they're all noises made while thinking, and now we're going to replace that noise. We're going to think in silence. So we're back to the whole idea of time warp and the adrenaline. We've got to recognize that silence of even this length seems like a long time. I have this experience regularly. I will get someone who is saying way too much to get rid of them. And their response is often this, but I can't talk that slow. And it's very hard to convince them without playing a video of them speaking that it is no slower at all. I'm going to do a short paragraph with a couple of sentences and listen to the length of this utterance, because it's exactly the same length. One has ums, one doesn't. If I talk to you with these thinking noises and they last about a second between phrases and sentences, I have the feeling that this is going pretty fast, but the truth is it's really not. If I talk to you without those thinking noises and replace them with 1 second of silence, I'm talking no faster or slower. I'm doing a direct substitution. 1 second of is eliminated, replaced by 1 second of silence. So that is the secret. If you're going to get rid of those thinking noises, and you must, you're an attorney, you've got to say to yourself, not stop saying The brain does not operate well on that negative instruction. In the same way you can't ski and ski down a mountain saying, don't fall down, because of course you will fall down. If you say to your brain, don't say don't say what, it's back. So we need the positive instruction instead. You've got to say to yourself, think in silence. And you've got to get comfortable with that silence. And you're wedging that silence between those chunks, between those phrases. Now, I will grant you this, there are times, sometimes, like right now, when we need to talk faster. Sometimes people say to me, but I can't put in all those pauses because someone else will jump in. So then we're going to tighten up those pauses. We're always speaking in phrases, but sometimes, like right now, between those phrases are no silences at all, but I'm continuing to speak in phrases. So if you thought of it as a shape, I'm talking in phrases, but between those phrases, there's no gap. There are other times when it's really complicated, and the listener needs more time to process. What did he just say? Boy, that's a complicated legal concept, and I'm your client who's not an attorney. And suddenly those silences get much bigger between the chunks. But this is the truth. You can't run until you learn to walk. You can't speak quickly and be articulate until you can speak slowly while being articulate. So that's the place to begin. You now need to speak in chunks or phrases while thinking in silence. And that's the way to fully employ how it is that your brain works to construct that utterance. So to remember what you've just learned, talk to yourself and say this. Hear the silence before you start to speak, and then use the silence as you begin. Say that. Also say this. My listener needs this broken down into chunks of information, both big and little. Say that. Also say this. Say aloud the structure of what you're going to say before you actually get to the details. And finally, don't let the thinking noises interfere with your listener's echo memory. Say that.